Dr. S. Vijayanandan, and we have with us as speakers Mr. Jerry Naxam, Dr. Shalom Gnanathanga Vincent, Ms. Akansha Tiwari, and Dr. Sally Bash, who is joining us online. Dr. S. Vijayanandan is a professor at the Department of Marine Biology, Microbiology, and Biochemistry at School of Marine Sciences, CUSAT, and Dean of Faculty of Marine Sciences, CUSAT. He has an experience of 28 years in research, development, and teaching in marine biology, marine pollution and ecotoxicology, climate science, and invertebrate taxonomy. Mr. Jerry Naxam is an associate professor at Monash Law School. His work focuses on intersections between environmental law, politics, history, and economics. He has authored several books on topics including international environmental treaties and their normative treatment, nuclear waste disposal in democratic states, on the phenomena of ecoterrorism, etc. Dr. Shalom Gnanathanga Vincent is the professor and head in the Department of Environmental Sciences, University of Kerala. Her broad research area is benthic ecology of coastal ecosystems. Her work is specifically focused on microbial and macro and meiofaunal diversity in the coastal environment of Kerala and relating the benthic diversity to environmental and anthropogenic impacts. Ms. Akansha Tiwari is a wildlife filmmaker and conservationist. She has been actively working to raise awareness about issues concerning marine wildlife and ecosystems. She has recently worked on a project called Tangled Seas, addressing the problem of discarding fishing gear in the Indian Ocean. Her film, the first on the topic in India, had an impact campaign that ran for 3 years to include awareness and outreach programs, activities, state-wise petitions, and formulated the creation of an open access Indian Ocean GhostNet repository. Dr. Sally Bash is strategic advisor at Climate Work Center, a think tank embedded with Monash University, and is an associate with the University of Tasmania's Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. She has worked for over 2 decades across climate policy and oceans governance in advisory, diplomacy, and research roles. Now I invite the chair to please take over the proceedings.
Thank you. Great. Good morning to all of you. So happy to be in front of all of you for this Australia-India Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative Partnership Dialogue on Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative Strengthening International Cooperation, organized by the Center for Public Policy Research in collaboration with the Monash University and also with adequate support from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia. So now we've been here yesterday. I've just gone through the various sessions. So happy that the CPPR is wonderfully organizing this meeting. Today, the first session we had very interesting, the ASEAN and the strategic convergences, exploring the strategic convergences in the IPOA and the ASEAN region, especially Australia and India. What are the strategic areas? Now, this session we are now devoting to marine litter and debris in the Bay of Bengal. Now, I'll just go to the IORA conference because I remember Dr. Vijay is also here. Last year, I was in fact very fortunate to be leading the session for the Indian Ocean. Yeah, the entire IORA of marine science. I was so fortunate to see, address and discuss. And of course, I was wearing the almost 7 to 8 countries, I remember. Fiji, I think Maldives, so many African nations, all were deliberating on various issues on security, economic aspects, pollution, ecology. I think the ecology is the buzzword. Because we never, I think in the morning session of the ASEAN also, I was hearing the word ecology. So we never had this word ecology when Hector coined this term, you know. It was lost so many years back. Now this ecology is getting revived. The ecosystem, the word ecosystem and ecology is getting revived tremendously in all circuits of our activity. So I see the importance of ecology and ecosystem is very, very valid. Maybe in politics, maybe in relationships, maybe in our day-to-day activities, maybe in our management for marine litter also. That's also very important. So in this IORA and international arena, what we just have to issue is in the IORA conference also, we had this as a big issue. Of course, everything was linked to, largely it was linked to fishing and fishing rights and mining, exploration, benefits, economic security, and all these issues came up in the IORA meeting. I would say this was just a figment or a fragment of what broadly was discussed in the IORA meeting. And this is very important that CPPR has certainly built this and put this as one of the most crucial and important aspects of today's deliberation. And this and we are facing the largest, very serious threat on marine litter. Of course, I have very four distinguished speakers in the panel who will be speaking on, who will be deliberating for the next almost 40 minutes on various aspects of marine litter. The legal aspects, yes, the legal entity is very, very important. Not, I think, Dr. Shah giving you the issues and the different, the ecological implications. But we do not know much about the legal implications. I was attending one of the international conferences a couple of years back. We had a lawyer from Mumbai, and he was speaking wonderfully. I don't remember his name. He was a sought-after speaker in world forums. I remember him speaking on internet. He was there in our one of the meetings in the Southeast Asian countries, and we were all sitting. And the legal implications are tremendous. And my friend from Monash, he will definitely be giving the legal and the transboundary or the transboundary issues. See, this is marine litter is transboundary. It is not for a specific region or a specific, it cannot be contained in a specific region. The ecology changes once it goes beyond boundaries. So the boundary and beyond boundaries, of course, the ASEAN and other international forums, definitely there are many forums. Even whenever my friend from Monash speaks, he will definitely delve into the different conventions under the UNCLOS. Even the UNCLOS is a broad thing under the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals 14 clearly demands that our oceans should be used for sustainable practices. It should be free from marine pollution. And the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, the achievements have very well been marked in Sustainable Goals. And very recently, the recent IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have been releasing several reports. And I was just going through a very recent report last week, which dwells very much on the issues of marine litter and how it's going to accelerate your climate change phenomenon. Because it's going to create a kind of initiation, the warming issues. Even I think Kochi used to be, the Kochi where we are sitting used to be very convenient and because we are on the border of the ocean, or the Arabian Sea, the queen of the Arabian Sea. But today things have changed. In Kerala, so we call it as a God's own country, it is getting changed, it is transforming. And among the global records of IPCC, Kochi is one of the centers which is going to face the wrath of the climate change. And it's going to have a sea level rise and it may get inundated. I cannot predict it. So this is the situation where the buzzword, the topic is very, very relevant and most appropriate for initiating the dialogue and the discussion today. I'm not going to take much time because we have these learned speakers. Of course, my friend Akansha Tiwari is also a wildlife filmmaker. She should have definitely filmed the havoc and in terms of ecology and ecosystem changes, what's happening or ravaging our ecosystems globally, transboundary. And my friend, yes, she's from Australia, Sally Buckley, a strategic advisor from Climate Works Australia, will also be dwelling on her experiences on the issue of marine litter. But when you go to marine litter, let us, I don't want to dwell much on, I just can say that marine litter is nothing but, it's a collection of all your materials which you discard, or any, it is just persistent. It's the persistent material which is discarded, maybe solid, maybe discarded or abandoned or in the coastal or marine environment. That forms your marine litter. And it can be, it is, I was just going through the first slide on Mekong River Valley. All your global rivers, the Indus, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, the Ganga, the Ganges, all are your major rivers are the source of your marine litter. That's a very important. There's a very recent report which has come up in Nature reports also. Your global rivers, including the Mekong River Valley, the Ganges, are all major sources of your marine litter and plastics. So your rivers and major sources which leads to the oceans. So when I say that it is the abandoned gears, the abandoned cargoes, the abandoned materials, all forms this large conglomeration of marine litter. And this debris, I have seen the United Nations Environment estimates that over 15% of the marine litter floats on the surface of the sea. This 15% only remains on the surface. The rest of the 70% goes to the bottom, settles. And once this settles, I think my friend from Sally, I think Dr. Shalam also is a benthic specialist, goes to the benthic food chain. Ecological changes are more glaring. Similarly, so we understand that almost 70% is settling. What we do float, and you have the international programs to remove the marine litter and plastics, but it's on the surface. But what goes to the bottom is a very complex phenomenon. You need to think on that. Similarly, global plastics. The global plastics forms one of the most vital and integral part of marine litter. Yes, it has been exponentially increasing over the last several decades. If you look at the production annually, 400 million tons of plastics now are produced globally. But estimates that 12% of the plastic produced is incinerated, only 9% has been recycled. And this forms a very vital component of the marine litter. And the remainder goes to landfills and released to the environment, including into the oceans. So we need to, if we look at almost 11 million tons of plastics in 2016, it goes into the ecosystem, has now increased to about 29 million tons, according to United Nations Environmental Program, that is 2021. So it explains that it is not only causing ecological, it is causing marine life disruption, it is causing trophic disruptions, it is causing human and economic loss. So what we need to look into is the larger aspect of marine pollution, because marine litter and debris causes the larger effects of marine ecotoxicological impacts. Ecotoxicological, the risk factor, pollution aspects, the risk, human risk and human survival is largely linked to the litter issues. So now I was just going through an article last day where it has said that your human blood and your human and animal tissues have got uptakes of marine and other such kinds of plastics. Yeah. So the point is, finally, when you look, we need to look into the Sustainable Development Goals 14, which largely looks for the marine litter management. So today, we have an alarming issue of marine plastic issues in the Bay of Bengal. And we know that over 6 million tons of fish are nearly caught from the Bay of Bengal region, and of which about 4% nearly contributes to the global catch. And fishery is something which is seriously getting affected in the Bay of Bengal region. So what we will be discussing specific to the Bay of Bengal region, where marine litter how it is going to cause serious issues on various angles of the ecological issues, the legal issues, the issues which is happening in the wildlife, and several related aspects. So what we will decide today, being the chair of this session, what I will decide, I think with my due respect to my colleagues in the panel, I will just decide that we will have about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, that will be sufficient. Yes, yes, we'll have, so we'll wind up at least by 11 o'clock. We'll have a very healthy discussion. That's what I just think, that about 20 to 25 minutes we'll go for discussion among the distinguished delegates here. So I think I'll just first call upon my friend, Mr. Gavi, Associate Professor at Monash University, Australia. And I think you can take about 10 to 12 minutes, at the extended 15 minutes. Yes, 12, yes. So the end of it, I think we need to wind up this session by about presentations by about 11 o'clock. I think I've crossed my time. I had a slip right here with me. That's okay, because when I speak about marine litter and plastics, I just get really enthusiastic. Yeah. Thank you all, and we'll go to the sessions. Thank you.
I feel like I'm going to have to speak very, very fast. So thank you for that. All right. How about with 10 minutes in, you give me a 2-minute warning, and then I can try to wrap everything up so that it can be on time. So good morning, everybody. Can you all hear? Yeah. All right. That's better sort of thing. So, all right. It's lovely to be here, and my thanks also to DFAT for sponsoring this. So there's 5 things I want to talk about today. One is the current situation in the Bay of Bengal. I want to look very much at what are the national sort of regulatory frameworks that currently exist. I also would then like to look at the regional frameworks and how they could be improved. I then will look at the international, currently fragmented sort of regulatory sort of overview of what's going on. And lastly, if I get time, I will look at the current negotiations for a global plastics treaty. So, I'll do it this way, I think it's easier for me to read. Oh, that never works, does it? So, we have the current extent and increasing rates of plastic pollution entering the Bay of Bengal represents for many of us an environmental and public health crisis. Recent findings estimate that approximately 3 billion microplastic particles enter the bay each day from the Ganges River. And for example, from just Bangladesh alone, they estimate that 200,000 metric tons of plastic waste enter into the bay. So it creates not only a heavily littered bay area, but it dangerously pollutes the Ganges basin, which, as we know, is relied on by 655 million inhabitants. As my colleague pointed out, there's microplastics, nanoplastics being developed, etc., etc. All right, I'm going to go very fast for this. All right. As was alluded to, the impact of plastic pollution in the bay on local fisheries is also very stark. The bay produces approximately 6 million tonnes of fish, which is equivalent to 4% of the global catch. And the region also has a $4 billion fishery production value, and 3.7 million local inhabitants work as fishermen. However, we've noted that both the bay's waters and mangroves are filled with microplastics, which is harming fish species such as marlin. So the first problem that I really want to allude to is that when I came to do research on this topic, and I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on national plastic regulatory frameworks, attempting to understand the nature and various sources of plastic water pollution in the region is extremely problematic. There are very limited studies and empirical field data on the Bay region. So the first thing I would urge that we need to do is increase the number of scientific studies of the nature of the problem. In terms of the national legal regimes for the Bay of Bengal's littoral states. Regular attempts to address marine plastic pollution in the Bay are also evident from national law. The most common, albeit somewhat ancillary, regulatory instruments with respect to regulating single-use plastic pollution in the Bay are legal bans or taxes on single-use plastics. Since 2002, India and Bangladesh have introduced bans on plastic bag use. India passed a ban in 2002 and 2005 related to the use of plastic bags of different thickness, and the South Indian state of Karnataka also imposed a complete ban on plastic bags in 2016. Now, this was implemented as a preventative measure from cows from consuming food containing plastics and to avoid clogs in municipal drain systems. In Bangladesh, legislation was passed in 2002 that prohibited the production and use of plastics. And the key reason given for the ban was the tendency of submerged plastic bags to aggravate the cause of major flooding events. Now, in terms of the recycling structures that are available, Rafi indicates that India requires what he calls a recycling revolution to address the huge volumes of leakages in plastic waste, noting that the Indian Ministry of the Environment has stated that plastic is not a problem per se, but really the issue is uncollected plastic waste that is responsible for India's plastic crisis. The Materials Recycling Association has identified that India's recycling rates are only 30%. But when you consider that globally recycling rates are only 9%, India, at least on the official figures, is doing quite well. India's primary authority on recycling, the Central Pollution Control Board, estimates that India generates 13 lakh tonnes of plastics annually, but noted that there are approximately 5,000 registered plastic manufacturing recycling units and approximately 100 unregistered units. The research at this stage, again, the second problem I'd like to highlight, is that many Indian states do not report recycled plastic with no information relating to records of the capacity of these plastic recycling units in terms of the volume of waste that can be dealt with. I'm going through very quickly. All right, so what's the scope then for developing a regional regulatory infrastructure around the Bay of Bengal? I would argue that the transboundary nature of the pollution in the Bay warrants the best efforts of various cooperative states to address this issue. With international efforts and collaboration between nations in the regions, such as India, Bangladesh, but also countries like China, there are a number of mechanisms that could be created that could form a regional regulatory infrastructure system. But there are a number of conceptual challenges for a regional regulatory infrastructure that I'd like to highlight. So scholarship has addressed the role and scope of potential regulatory mechanisms for marine pollution in the Bay at a regional level. A study by the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in February 2021 identified key challenges with the task of addressing marine plastic pollution. And there are 4 issues that we need to consider, and I'll talk about them in Q&A time, but for the purposes of brevity, they would be the level of implementation, what are the resources we're giving for that, how engaged is the private sector, the perennial problem, as any international environmental lawyer will tell you, of monitoring and assessing how our programs are going, and how, lastly, how best to engage a multi-stakeholder approach. All right. I'm going to flip through very quickly. Okay. So, in relation to particular mechanisms to address the plastic pollution issue in the area, the Bay of Bengal crisis webpage notes that the installation of waterway sea bins and plastic interceptor systems could slash the volume of plastics entering from rivers and streams. GSAMP has similarly emphasised the potential role that may be played by local waste management, identifying that the actual leakages of plastic litter entering the sea depends greatly on the adequacy of municipal waste management systems. And the webpage, I think, and I quote here, says that one way to resolve this issue might be to employ a local workforce and be recording data as rubbish collected. The local economy, if we do so, will benefit. Poverty can be reduced, and the data can be used by software to reinforce rubbish filtering in critical locations. We have another speaker today who will speak on similar programs. Instead of having to fight the problem, reducing it at its source could be a better option. Currently, when you look at plastics, they talk very much about what are called the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. But that isn't really effective in removing plastic emissions. We need to also consider what are called 2 other R's: reuse and redesign. They need to be very much enforced, which at the moment within any of the countries in the Bay of Bengal area, they are not. We need to ban packaged food like styrofoam. We need to redesign the food market in dense cities. And we need to provide proper accessible disposal sites at the market. Oh, I've got 3 minutes to do the entire world. Okay. No pressure, he says. So internationally, at the moment, as was alluded to by our chair, we've got a number of different sort of conventions that sort of overlap when it comes to the question of plastic. And so the most pertinent ones would be such like the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, which since 2019 has declared that plastic is a hazardous waste that cannot be exported or imported easily without a much more greater system of certification. We've got UNCLOS, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which alludes to marine litter. We've got what's called the Marine Pollution Conventions, and we have things like the Ocean Charter and the UN Resolution on Marine Litter and Microplastics. So at the moment, we have a number of treaties that impact on the question of plastic, but are not actually focused on it. And so that's considered to be, from a lawyer's point of view, a very poor system. It's too fragmented to be effective. So last month, some of you may be aware, but if not, I'm about to tell you about it. The world got together and decided to create the very first, hopefully, Global Plastics Treaty. I was in Nairobi, Kenya for this last month watching it, and it was a really fascinating experience. So last month, on the 2nd of March, representatives from 175 nations endorsed a resolution to end plastic pollution and develop an internationally legally binding agreement by February the 26th, 2024. Now, as an international lawyer, I can tell you that is incredibly ambitious. The convention, for instance, on tropical timber took 19 years to develop. So hopefully we can do better than that this time. The resolution was titled End Plastic Pollution Towards an Internationally Legally Binding Instrument. And what made it interesting from a lawyer's perspective was initially it was designed very much to focus only on the question of marine plastic pollution. But the resolution actually looks at what's called the entire life cycle. So it wants to ask questions about whether or not we should be producing more plastic going forward, all right? Rather than just deal with this as a plastic waste problem, which is a lot more effective to do so. Now, at this stage, though it's not clarified, it's most likely that any sort of agreement that comes forth will be based on the Paris Climate Accords, which would be a voluntary system. But there is still space and time for nation states like India and Australia to call for a stronger sort of treaty that would actually impose more rigorous sort of commitments from various states. So the final resolution from the executive director called on basically to promote sustainable production and consumption of plastics, including amongst others product design and environmentally sound waste management, including through resource efficiency and adopting what's known as the circular economy, where things that are created are brought back and forth and recycled properly. Now, on the final note, I think I'm within time, the new agreement is also expected to include provisions to promote national and international cooperative measures to reduce plastic pollution in the marine environment. So from our perspective, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions about it, but we're going from beyond the sort of questions around just the marine environment, but there will still be scope within the actual treaty itself to sort of address the ongoing issues of marine plastic pollution. I thank you, and I think I'm under 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Great, you kept your time, and we will sum up at the end of it. Now we go to the next speaker. I'll just call upon my friend, Dr. Shalom Nyanathanga Vincent. She's a professor at Kerala University at the School of Environmental Sciences. Yeah, please. So you have your time up, 10 minutes.
Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning, dear Chair, my colleagues and dignitaries. Thank you for this opportunity. So we'll be discussing on marine plastic pollution in the southwest coast of India, with special reference to mitigation, monitoring, and also management mitigatory measures. So as already pointed out by the chair, go to the next slide. So talking about this marine plastic pollution, it's already been discussed that 80% of the plastics that are in the marine environment comes from the terrestrial environment, or the origin is terrestrial. So when you see our southwest coast of India, I can just imagine the factors, or when you see the DPCR framework that contributes to marine plastic pollution. The pressures mainly accounts for population density in the coastal areas, particularly within the 50 kilometer. So most of the plastic that comes to the marine environment is within 50 kilometers of the coast, and we see that in India we have a very intense coastal population, almost 250 million people residing within 50 kilometers. And we see the geographical setting, geomorphological setting, I should say, that differs the west and the east coast. So we have a narrow strip and a very sharp pattern of land pattern on the west coast compared to a more plain area in the east coast. And there are also reports of plastics. The contributor of plastics, when we consider the rivers, the Ganges that contributes to, it's the second most contributor of plastic pollution to the Bay of Bengal. And also India ranks 12th in contributing to marine plastic pollution. And this area we see, talking of ecology, very sensitive area, we have almost 7,560 coastal line, include the mainland and the islands, and more rivers putting off their water, along with water, the pollutants and sediments, and also plastic come to the shoreline and also into the oceans. So we have more sensitive areas like marine protected areas with almost 1,500 coastal wetlands who are very sensitive, very fragile, and also contribute to marine productivity. So all these has to be taken into focus while considering the marine plastic pollution. And the next slide, please. And there's a lot of scope when we see our position, the mismanaged litter. So that's possible. That's in our hands. What we can manage, we can recycle or reuse, we can properly manage, so that we don't pour more litter into the environment. Next slide, please. Yeah. So my talk basically is on monitoring, and second aspect is on management or reduction cleanup. Monitoring, we scan the literature, we can see that there are more traditional methods like surveys, beach cleanups, using a citizen science approach, and also there are other methods using ship-based surveys, and also more scientific methods involving remote sensing techniques using satellite data, optical methods, photography, videography, and also hyperspectral imaging, echo sounder techniques. All that we need not go and physically collect the data, but even without that, we are able to now understand what is the extent of marine plastic pollution, or the litter, quantitative litter that is present in the marine, both in the water column and also in the sediment. Next. So this was one of the studies that we conducted in the southwest coast of India for Blue Charter Fellowship Commonwealth, funded by Commonwealth and the University of Newcastle, Australia, on the occurrence of distribution and also the characteristic of microplastics in the water and surface sediments of the southwest coast of India. We could find that characteristic types of microplastics were found and based on that we could also identify the sources. Can we have this next slide? Okay, so this are two different studies, one on the beach around 60 kilometers from Goa to Varkala, Trivandrum district, and also one in offshore from Chennai to Goa, around Tippin, Sagakandia. My student Ashwin, he went in the cruise and took samples from 2 transects of water from the surface and at 100 meter depth and also in the sediments. So some of the results I would like to highlight in this, the next slide, that we could find that these are the map shows the sampling points. Can I have a point? Yeah. This shows the sampling points. Most of them were at the west coast, of course, and only a few points in the east coast and also some in the Indian Ocean. And most of them were fibers, and also in the west coast we could find most of fibers which comes from the cloth and also from the fishing gear, and also the fragments which are obviously from broken larger macroplastics and also mesoplastics. And one thing we could observe that almost 27 types of polymers on characterization we could find 27 types of polymers that contribute to buried plastic pollution, and also on my electromicrograph showing the cracks present in the small pieces of plastic. So these cracks are reported to harbor both pathogenic microorganisms and also persistent organic pollutants. So they act as Trojan horses of these contaminants that can be transported in the marine environment. Next. And another one study that we have found the presence of microplastic in the gastrointestinal tract of commercial fish from the Bay of Bengal. They are collected from Chennai and also a southern part from the Nagapattinam coast. Only the commercial fishes, and we could find the presence of microplastics in the gastrointestinal tract. And this is an electron microscope photograph of presence of bacteria on the surface of this microplastics present in the inside the from the gastrointestinal tract of fishes collected, commercial fishes collected from this course. Yes. And after my fellowship program, I could conduct a knowledge exchange program also, which was funded by the ASU, and this was just to make the local people aware. So this was conducted along with the corporation of Kollam Corporation in the southern coast of Kerala, just to create an awareness and also make the local people aware. The stakeholders included policymakers, the local self-government, the local people, fishermen, and all the local communities that were in that particular area, to make them aware of the different types of plastics, the different type of polymers, and how they should be managed, scientifically managed, so this was to create an awareness in the local communities. Next slide. And also, practically, we could show them how this type of plastics are present, the different type of plastics that could be present in the marine environment, and how they should be managed before they reach the marine environment. Okay. And next part of my paper is management. So first thing when we think of management is alternatives. So now there are a lot of things coming up in the form of bioplastics. So there are a lot of buzzwords like biocombustible, biodegradable, polymers, plant-based, degradable. So this all sometimes confuse the particular customer or a shopper. So there should be some yardstick to show how far these biopolymers, when they claim the corporates claim the green credentials, so how far they can be degraded, or how far this can be used, and what are the different types of biopolymers that can be used for specific purposes. So that also has a big challenge, because now when we go for alternatives to plastics, because there should be some material that has to be used instead of plastic. So we go for biopolymers, that are certain challenges before us that we should face when we use bioplastics. And this, for what I've tried, I cannot explain all this. So there are different types of letters are also small. This shows the different types of bioplastics and the definitions. And this is one classic. Yeah, so it's time, different types of biopolymers we have. There are opportunities for use. One classical example, company M&M, which is using the great. Okay, so bioplastics is a good possibility for the circular economy model. Next, so just skip on. So already Professor Jelis talked about this laws and also policies. And in Kerala there was a single-use ban of plastics. And we have a roadmap also with how plastic waste management. There's a collection from houses, and we have a material collection facility. From there it goes to the resource recovery facility, and it is done by the Harita Karma Seda and the local women group, self-help groups called the Kutubushi group, and they get a user fee, and they earn out of this recycling process. And finally, it is collected by the Clean Kerala Company, where possible materials are recycled and others are shredded and used for road use. And this is one that has a possibility of reuse of or recycling of waste by using this principle of extended producer responsibility, maybe by the company itself or by engaging a producer responsibility organization. Just 1 minute. Two companies like this classical examples like Nilma and Bedco are into EPR in Kerala, which take back the products if they are properly recycled. But there are a lot of loopholes. For example, when we have a fruity cover, fruity Tetra Pak, there's a strawberry in that. But people just throw out the straw. People are not aware of that. There is a EPR in that. It is written in very small letters that people do not know. If we know that there's EPR in that, we'll just give written back to the producer. But that is not known to the people. So these type of things should be made more aware to the public, so that there is an EPR, you can return your waste, plastic waste to the producer. Next. And recently I got the DAP grant from the Barrier 5, the consulate chief, the High Commissioner of Australia for the sustainable management of plastic waste. So this is a big success story that I could focus on clean sea mission, where the fishermen collect the plastic waste that is along with the fish, what they collect from the sea. They don't throw it to the sea, they bring it to the shore, and they recycle using a circular economy model. And there are women who survive, who make their livelihood by recycling the plastic waste. So this is a success story, and we are going to quantify it, that project, and also we are going to identify the source from where this marine plastic comes, and so that we can design suitable policy measures. So I stopped with this. I had a small video to show, but there's no time. This was for Ocean Decade, which we prepared as a satellite event. The Ocean Decade last February was done by the United Nations and DMB of Germany, and we had a satellite event on this success story. So I'm not showing that. So my take-home message is think globally and act locally. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good. That's good. Now, please, I now welcome Miss Akansha Tiwari, a wildlife filmmaker, for her presentation.
Yeah. Right. Thank you to CPPR, Monash University, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for this opportunity, and including conservation in this conversation, which is ignored most times.
So I'm glad this is happening. Right, so my paper is about the stakes and stakeholders that marine debris in the Bay of Bengal, the stakes and stakeholders of marine debris in the Bay of Bengal. The stakes would be, so marine debris includes fishing nets and sources which have source. Okay, I'm going to start over. So marine debris includes all the trash that is there in fishing nets which have sources on land. And they are basically alien materials for underwater ecosystems. Then they also injure marine wildlife. It cuts sunlight because this debris basically creates like a, the debris on the surface cuts off sunlight for the planktons, which kind of give us about 70% of our oxygen, and that kind of creates a problem. And we are not able to get that access. I'm gonna just take a moment. 1 second. So marine debris harms wildlife, causing permanent injuries, entanglement, starvation, and death. Marine debris on the surface creates a layer for sunlight to reach the planktons directly, which are responsible for giving us over 70% of the oxygen. Marine garbage creates a large geographical anomaly, which is inconvenient to marine wildlife and the ecosystem. And there is a lot of trash that enters the fishing nets with pearl nets and shore seal nets that are, there is plastic waste in it and there's jellyfish in it, so they're not able to distinguish and find a good catch in it. Those nets are heavy and harmful even to the humans in the underwater environment. And marine debris becomes microplastic and enters our food web, reaching us, where there are recent reports that there was also microplastic found in blood. Next slide. Okay, stakeholders. I always, according to my observation, I have realized that when we talk about stakeholders, we look at nations and nationwide stakeholders and ignore the local level stakeholders. For example, what I mean by that is that when you look at ocean conservation issues, there are always people or communities that depend on it for livelihood, which would be in this case the fishermen and the recreational diver, not the scientific diver, but the recreational diver, because they depend on it regularly for their work. So we include those, we include the people that study this ecosystem, which would be scientists, biologists, ecologists, researchers, and also the people who make policies related to this ecosystem. So we need to remember that stakeholders should not only mean the bureaucrats, but also the people that directly depend upon this ecosystem. Next. Right, so I have a few policy recommendations that I have listed down. Public access to data would be something, right, public access to data is something that I have seen is a gap in most cleanup initiatives, because there are all these reports that exist, like there are organizations, high-level organizations and conventions that create these reports, get a lot of international funding, and then there is no access to it. So if I want to do like a local level cleanup, if I want to do a smaller scale cleanup, I don't have data for it. And then we don't have the funding, the smaller cleanups don't have the funding to start over. And, you know, and this data takes a lot of time as well. So if that access is not there, there's a lot of gatekeeping that happens, and then nobody is able to do it on a smaller scale. Next, yeah. So disparity between stakeholders and lawmakers is another major issue that I have observed. For example, the fishermen and the fishing community, from whenever there are conferences or whenever there are policies that are made for them, these fishing communities will have representatives. You will not find actual artisanal fishermen in there. You will find either a large-scale fisherman representative, or you will find somebody who is like a privileged large-scale fisherman who is representative, or you will find a researcher or a scientist who has access to these artisanal fishermen. So you don't really have them present whenever these meetings or decisions are made. For example, we could look at the coastal road. The Koli community knew something was happening, but they're protesting now and they're facing problems because obviously when those policies were made, that decision was made, the project got a green light, they were not asked. So we could maybe, whenever we have these conversations, we should include all the stakeholders like it was mentioned. Next. Yeah. Marine debris, for those who are not studying or working on ocean ecosystems, is a relatively lesser known concept. There are these laws, there are bans happening, but when I was working on my film Tangle Seas, one of the major issues that I faced was people, for example, who live in Delhi, were telling me, I don't eat seafood, I don't live close to the ocean, what do I do with this? How is it my problem? So just that little awareness that even the cities, the waste from the cities enter the rivers and then it enters into the ocean, and it is a global, or it's even problematic to cities, and it's not only something that somebody on the coast should deal with. Next. Right. So there is standardization, there is UNEP standardization, there are a lot of standardization for collection of data when it comes to documentation, but the divers that collect these nets do not know what happens to them after that. There's a lot of collection happening on a lot of fronts. Fishermen are collecting, cleanups are happening, divers are doing dive against debris, but they don't know, the nets are just collected in some corner. They're not being repurposed, they're not being recycled. So there should be some standardization of what happens to the storage and what happens after it, because if some organization wants to use them and recycle them, they should know where I can find these nets. Yeah, non-coastal cities except metros are the ones that create most trash that enters the sea through waterways. Here I mentioned non-metro because I hope that they have a stable cleaning system. And what happens is states like Goa or the coastal states are responsible for always having these policies, laws, and cleanups that are happening. But like I mentioned, trash comes from everywhere. Next. Yeah. Outlets of rivers into the sea must be monitored and regulated. The environmental impact assessment should be a little bit more stringent with the river systems and whatever goes into these ocean, goes into these water bodies, because there are a lot of hotels, fancy five-star hotels that violate the CRZ in places like Mumbai and Goa, and you can see a direct pipe going from their sewage pipe going directly into the ocean, and there is no impact assessment that happens. And no accountability. So that is creating policies or laws to control that is much easier than having to identify accumulation zones in the ocean later. And this is also like, specific locations of where these outlets will be compared to like having the whole ocean where you have to identify accumulation zones. Right, next. Funding should be provided for mechanical cleanups and benthic and underwater trash by individuals such as divers. One stakeholder that we've already always missed out of these things is the diver, the recreational diver who has access to this ecosystem and has knowledge of the landscape, and their cleanups are comparatively much more cost efficient than large-scale cleanups. So cleanups should not only happen on the surface, but also on the benthic levels and underwater levels, because when it happens on the surface, it can end up killing that surface pelagic ecosystem, animals in that ecosystem like the Portuguese man-o-war and all of them, which is the funding. Most of the projects are getting funding for only surface cleanups right now. Next. Yeah. Research should be aided to change the source material of the litter and look at biodegradable alternatives, because we need to remember that every plastic that was ever created still exists in a landfill or in the ocean. So it's not going to go anywhere. It might become microplastic, but we need to start working on changing the source material, because the nets that are not collected or taken out still exist in the ocean and will continue to do so. Right, that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Akansha. Great. Thank you so much. I mean, I think you gave an overall perspective on. Now we have our next speaker, Dr. Sally Bakre. She's a strategic advisor, Climate Works Australia. Dr. Sally, good morning from India. Can you hear?
Good morning, I can. Can you hear me? Yeah. I am going to share my screen. Has that worked? Just one moment. Great, thanks a lot. And thanks to the organisers for having me speak here at this conference today. And I regret that I can't be with you there in this beautiful location. I would start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to all Indigenous elders, including those throughout the broader Indian Ocean, and acknowledge their connection to land and sea. Today I'm talking to you, today I'm talking to you about the issue a little more broadly than our previous speakers, that of maritime security. Sorry, I'm just having a small computer glitch here. All right, thank you. That of maritime security in the modern context as it extends beyond the traditional definition. So I'm talking about maritime security in areas of resource security, sustainability, and climate-induced threats. I'm hoping that this will tie together something of the first session and the session you've heard today on marine debris, which is certainly one maritime security threat that we're facing. I've decided to use maps today throughout my presentation because I think the various ways we can represent a single area is really interesting in maps and provides an insight into the many ways and sectors on which we can form relations in a region. Recent years have seen a heightened interest in the regional positioning and global influence of the Indo-Pacific, and interest in this large maritime area comes from states both within and beyond it, including the external Quad nations of Japan, the US, and Australia. As Dr. Vin touched upon, this rise in attention to the Indo-Pacific has led to a slight shift in ASEAN's position. And while it still remains the Central Asian grouping, there is certainly an emerging role for and voice coming from the new Indo-Pacific multilateral architecture. This positioning of the Indo-Pacific as free, open, and resilient has been perpetuated by India's leadership in both the region and on the international stage. And there are a range of examples of that, including the recent Security Council session on maritime security, looking at the rule-based order that India chaired under the LOSC, or the Law of the Sea Convention. Interestingly, this rising importance of the Indo-Pacific makes us rethink the way we look about the boundaries of regions, and it starts letting us imagine these groupings more fluidly, and in particular looking at the overlaps and shared objectives between ASEAN and Indo-Pacific countries. There are other changes that are happening as well. Geopolitical discussions have seen a shift in focus from landscapes to that of seascapes. Here, ocean-based activities are increasingly looking not only at relations, but at broader geopolitical issues. We have a range of great opportunities in the maritime area as well, looking at the dimensions that are offered by regional cohesion and connectivity, which are much greater than was previously available when they were single country maritime interests. So although focused on the Indo-Pacific, I'm also going to focus largely on the sub-region of the Bay of Bengal, which is where our debris talk today was all about. In examining issues of the broader region, it's good to put a smaller lens on some areas sometimes. And this region provides not only a debris problem, but a really interesting example of maritime security and prosperity challenges and opportunities. I'm going to skip through here just a little quickly and move on through here. This slide just acknowledges the issue of importance in the area that the Straits of Malacca play, in that they are one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, and there's a high level of geostrategic importance for the Bay of Bengal to China and their growing interest in this area in regard to the Belt and Road Initiative and the critical trade in fossil fuels for countries all around that use this area for transport of their resources. The Bay of Bengal is one of the most climate vulnerable areas in the world. Climate change impacts are expected to be greater in the Bay of Bengal than in almost all other regions. This is because surface warming has and is anticipated to continue to be one of the highest rates globally from this region, and it also has a large quantity of low-lying lands. As such, the climate-induced changes are going to lead to a heightened likelihood of natural disasters in the region, intensified droughts and monsoons. Adding to these extreme weather events, there are issues of competition for natural resources, and there's a high level of human displacement and migration in the Bay of Bengal. In fact, estimates suggest that about 1.2 million people in the Indian Sundarbans alone will become climate refugees between 2030 and 2050. So this is one of the most highly climate vulnerable areas in the world in terms of human migration. Significant investment in climate adaptation is needed. This investment can't be understated, the need for this. And it's not only through traditional means, but also through the application of more nascent economic models, such as private-public partnership initiatives. Transformational change is needed to manage the human and environmental impacts of climate change. And regional action is needed because of the scale of these challenges. A great example of this is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which has the objective, as was stated earlier in the prior session, of ensuring the safety, security and stability of the maritime domain, and relies on the 7 pillars. India and Australia are partnering on the marine ecology pillar, and I'll touch on that again later. The Indo-Pacific, in addition to its significant strategic position and shared security threats, is increasingly recognised as an area of substantial economic maritime potential. And the extent to which the blue economic development can be harnessed will significantly impact the stability and security of the region. As mentioned earlier, the Bay of Bengal is one of the largest marine ecosystems in the world. The maritime territory, split between 7 bordering states, has around 400 million people who are dependent on coastal and marine resources for both their livelihood and their security. It has internationally a really interesting legal status. We talk about the Law of the Sea Convention broadly, but in this area, as a semi-enclosed sea, it sits under Article 123, and all member states of the Bay of Bengal are members of the Law of the Sea Convention. And this Article 123 confers upon them a responsibility for coordinated management, conservation, exploration and exploitation of living resources, and of the protection and preservation of the marine environment. It also talks about coordinated scientific research policies, joint programs, and about the participation of other states or international organisations from outside the region. With nearly a quarter of the world's population and a combined GDP of just under $4 trillion, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC, which is much easier than the mouthful of the entire name, has emerged as an influential engine of economic growth and regional governance. Established initially in relation to preferential trading and a free trade area, which was a logical starting point, given how busy it is as a shipping lane, BIMSTEC's now evolved into a more comprehensive policy forum. The most recent summit was held in 2022, and that really solidified a BIMSTEC charter, a road for connectivity, which establishes the basic structures and 7 key pillars, once again, with each country taking charge of a specific area. The pillars focus on the physical, human and ecological geographies of the Bay of Bengal, and the forum has a huge potential to respond to really broad challenges, things such as a blue-green economic recovery from the COVID pandemic are imminently possible under this. Really importantly, it's also begun to broaden its focus from being diplomatically driven to being more inclusive, having established a network of policy think tanks that will allow for engagement of a broader audience and mechanisms for regional consultation on policy matters. As with the broader Indo-Pacific area, The development of a sustainable blue economy has become an intrinsic policy priority across the region. States are reorienting their policy attention to include maritime-based national development goals and regional ones as a source of economic growth and livelihoods. With this, however, comes a fairly serious emerging concern, and that's a risk involved in focusing on blue economic development without sufficient contemplation of the Sustainable Development Framework. There's a really urgent need to link development of the blue economy in the region with the goals of Agenda 2030. And to date, it's not been a key feature of maritime development ambitions in this region. Evidence of this sits in the significant dead zone in the middle of the Bay of Bengal. It's a 60,000 kilometre area in which the ocean has become so degraded by deoxygenation that it's no longer able to support aquatic life. It's caused by a combination of the effects of climate change and warming oceans, but also by introduced nutrients and chemical runoff. Because of the size of the issue and the size of contributing factors, it's something that can only be remedied through a collaborative approach that directly contemplates both the environmental impacts of land-based and marine policy choices.
Can you hear? I'm sorry to intervene. I'm the chair of the session. Can
Yes.
you please hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, Dr. Sally, could you just conclude?
I will conclude,
Yes,
absolutely.
because we
Just
have
one
about
moment.
to conclude because we have another 10 to 12 minutes left for the session to conclude. So could you just
Okay, I have
yeah.
two very quick slides
Thank you so
left.
much.
States in the Bay of Bengal combating the threat of climate change and marine pollution. Under India's leadership, there's an emphasis on commitment to these issues, with technological capabilities being shared. This is a concept here of the offshore wind potential under the area. Where ASEAN sort of struggled sometimes with competition versus cooperation, BIMSTEC has an opportunity to invent itself in a new way and really focus on the complementary activities and planning. More broadly, however, we really need to ensure the negotiation of a successor to Agenda 2030. The opportunity in there is taken up by Bay of Bengal littoral states and IPOI members so that they align their ecological and geopolitical narratives, and they exert the level of influence that's potential due to the substantial population of the region and the high level of vulnerability of those living there going forward. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Sally. Can you hear us?
Thank you.
A brief question to Dr. Sally before she leaves, because we'll start from Dr. Sally, after which we'll go to the panel speakers. I would like to ask our delegates, any one of you, we can have just, yeah, please. We have a question for you, Dr. Sally. Just one question we will take. Yeah, please.
Thank you for the great presentations. So my question is about the regional or institutional framework in relation to marine debris pollution population to address this transboundary problem in the Bay of Bengal. You mentioned something about the BIMSTEC, but I wonder if you could share more in terms of how regional governments were able to make their contributions in terms of making this regional framework work. I think it has a lot of relevance because if this kind of cooperation in the Bay of Bengal really works, then it has far-reaching implications for other bodies of water like the South China Sea or the Sulawesi Seas. So whatever lessons or takeaways that you can share in terms of cooperation in the Bay of Bengal under the BIMSTEC framework, we'll be happy to hear that. Thank you.
Nice. Please, Dr. Sally, you have BIMTech. Yeah, please provide your, yeah, please.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think the question was largely the takeaway messages of how cooperation in BIMSTEC has occurred and where it can be remodeled. Please let me know if I've got that wrong. So BIMSTEC took a really slow start. It's been a couple of decades in the making, but the last 2 to 3 meetings. It's definitely solidified, and it seems to have formed a more focused area going forward. I think one of the takeaways is that it's looking not only at economic cooperation, but at the broad range of cooperative measures that can be done, so that with the 7 pillars, it looks at the scientific elements and the other areas as well. One of the other real benefits to BIMSTEC, as opposed to some of the other mechanisms in the Indo-Pacific, is that it is got a small membership and it's focused around a physical maritime area. And because of that, it's actually small enough to be functional and create a really useful framework. Whether it decides to expand its membership in the future is another question. It also has allocated each of the 7 pillars to one specific country to lead. So there's ownership of that area. And India has provided quite a lot of leadership in the area in directing some of the initial elements of each of those 7 pillars. So I think they're all useful things. It's also a space very much to watch. It's certainly growing in its maturity. Thanks.
Question from our friend Thomas. Yeah, please, quick. We are running short of time. We are late.
So I will directly come to the question.
Yes, please. That's great.
The question is that, do you feel that, because they're very enlightened and they're highly informative for the text, do you feel that the flexibility of international laws and the lack of enforcement of domestic laws that pave the way for the more literal debris or marine pollution?
Oh.
For example, just one thing is that in the UNCLOS, there is a clause for the free navigation which we discussed a lot, then the innocent passage is discussed a lot. And as a result of that, the multinationals operating their vessels, even the territorial waters, is dumping their waste. And is lack of implementation of the international. Domestic as highlighted, for example, CRSN is there. And the CRSN is working is not implemented in the country, because the leading judgment of the Supreme Court, the demolition of some 2-3 flats, which was constructed on the bridge of the Mandarin project, that was finally demolished, and the lot of waste was going. Then, apart from plastic, we have not mentioned about the oil spillage and the shipwrecking, because the Gujarat Coast, Amreli and Mitra, it just become one of the major hazards of this marine pollution.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sali, you have any? Is this to Dr. Sali? Mr. Sali, thank you, Dr. Sali. Yeah, this is, yeah. So I think.
Can I get you to repeat that question? I missed some of it, I'm afraid. Just a condensed version.
So I think you can, yeah, please, please.
Thank you. I want to ask to Professor Gary.
Gary, yes. You can give quick question answers. Quick. Huh? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. Make a short questions. How do you see marine debris coming out from shipping activities in the shipping?
In what sense?
Like, shipping also produce marine debris.
Well, at the moment, MARPOL technically regulates that, but unfortunately, MARPOL is not one of those treaties that is particularly implemented by people. But over the years, in terms of the areas that we're talking about, MARPOL has been the most successful of the treaties, but that's not saying a great deal, unfortunately. In terms of waste being thrown overboard, particularly plastic waste, there has been some movement there. But I would argue there needs to be a lot more in that space. There's still a lot of waste that's being dumped from ships illegally.
Okay, that's one.
Yep. Okay.
How do you see the reception facility at the ports around the Bay of Bengal? Is it proper? Is it sufficient to handle marine debris?
No, not at all, I'm afraid. Yeah, all the procedures. Right. If you're looking at the question of plastic from top to bottom, we have not engaged with that properly. So whether at the international environmental level with the treaty that hasn't been implemented yet, all the way down to, as you were pointing out, to sort of the local fisherman area and the local areas, we need a complete rethink of the entire issue. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think Bhaskar has got Dr. Bhaskar, please.
Just as a follow-up to what Yuri said, just wanted to inform the people here that DFAT has actually funded a project to study microplastics pollution from ports and shipping activity. And if anyone is interested, please see me. We are working with the University of Tasmania, is working with University of Mumbai and the Bombay College of Pharmacy, and we will be collecting sediment samples and so on to get empirical evidence of the scale of the problem. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think, Doctor, yeah, please.
Thank you. Okay, just two quick, very brief questions. First is for Dr. Selvam. You talked about, the fiber part of it, running downstream into the ocean and seas. We've already got a concept called as greening of equipment. Do you think it is time has come to create a kind of a plastic greening of sorts, say washing machines particularly, because that's one of the major sources of fiber running in downstream. And the second very quick question is for about fishing gear to Ms. Akansha. Now, do you think there's an opportunity for us to create a system in which when the fishermen buy their fishing nets or floats, we weigh them before we sell them, and we give them another consignment recovery process, so that we are literally accounting for each kilo or gram or whatever it is of the ghost gear that goes in? Or maybe we could even look at even technology solution, RFIDs, for each one of the nets that go down. I mean, what's your view on that subject?
Yeah, with regard to the fibers going out of the washing machine outlets. So with regard to India, I'm not sure that we have a common sewage that collects the wastewater from the washing machine and goes to the ocean. It's all about open washing. Most of the clothes that they are being cleaned are from the rivers or so. How can we? What are the policy that we can think of mitigating that or reducing that type of fibers from open wash? Washing machines, it's good, but it works for a common sewerage pattern.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please, Akansha.
Right. So I think that the fishing nets, there is already studies going on. They have geotagged the nets in some, I think, Netherlands somewhere, and that hasn't worked quite well. It won't work in the Indian context because we don't know where fishermen buy these nets from. In most cases, the large-scale fishermen, when their nets are you can't use them anymore. They sell them to the small-scale fishermen because the cost of these nets are very high. And they could also, maybe if they found another ghost net, they could have picked up from that. So being able to document all of that, and that would still, and if we implement what you suggested, that would change what happens in the future. But there are already enough nets that are bought illegally or not documented, and there are already enough nets in the ocean. We need to look at something for recycling what is already there, the ghost nets, because fishermen, small-scale fishermen, are much more aware. They don't want to lose their nets because these nets cost them in lakhs. And they, for example, in Chennai, if their nets are not working, they would use those to catch crabs. If it's not being used for one thing, they will use it for something else. So being able to tag it and document it will be a little difficult. So we will have to look at solutions for what is already there, recycle that, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I think our friend, we can take the last question. Yeah.
Yes. So there was mention earlier about the database. So I think that's a very good point to make, because if you cannot measure it, there's no way you can manage it, as they say. So this brings me into a question of, in terms of the available data, historical repository of data in relation to plastics being disposed in the Bay of Bengal by littoral states. Is there like a regional body or organization where this data is being put? And is it being shared to all littoral states? So,
Okay.
and if there's like any.
Your question, your question, yeah? Yeah, that's your question? That was your question? Yes, please, you have to answer.
Okay. Essentially, almost no information. So I've done a lot of work on like the US, China, the EU, Australia at the global level. It is surprising to me how little information there is in the Bay of Bengal area if you attempt to find it. So as I made a comment in my paper, the very first issue we have here is you can't solve a problem if you don't know the scope of it. And so a regional organisation, whether it be ASEAN or any of the regional groups, need to come together and sort of deal with this as fast as they can.
Akansha would like to add.
There are papers that exist, there are projects that are happening, but the data is not shared because of the fishing community and the fish industry is related to it. So there is either it could be classified also because it's shared water and it's not accessible. It might exist, but it's not public access.
Okay, thank you. I think you have it. There's one question from one of the Indian speakers online. With the recent restrictions of importance of plastic waste by China and Southeast Asia, have you seen any surge in plastic waste import to India? Yes, you have any answer for that? Waste import, plastic waste, maybe through different materials. Yes. Yeah.
I can't answer that question directly. I can say that we have seen a surge in. Okay. Okay. I'll try to answer it. The only surge I've seen the last 2 years has been around COVID-19 sort of plastic. We've seen an incredible surge because as we look around the room, everyone's wearing plastic sort of masks and the medical waste has improved. Other than that, I can't speak to whether or not there's more coming into India, unfortunately.
Okay, I think I can add to what Gary has told because there are a few consignments of waste. I think a lot of plastic-based electronic goods, a lot of plastic. There were a few consignments which were sent back. That was reported in the newspapers. And this is when we very relevant question which Dung has questioned from Singapore. This is very relevant. I think there are the third world countries, especially the Southeast Asian, many countries. India has been a hub of dumping ground, and this is anti-dumping, and so many issues are there coming up. So this is to be, we need to have a legal framework on those points, where whether there is a right, sovereign right from other right, the importing, and all these things have to be. Yes, this is true, and there are instances, but we cannot, we are not as highlighted in the Bay of Bengal, large marine ecosystem. We don't have data specifically on how much of specific data. These are all estimates. And definitely from these global estimates, we will be able to calculate for the large marine ecosystem like the Bay of Bengal. I think that's it. Thank you. Any you have anything? Yes, Dr. Martin. Yeah, I think we'll finish up with Martin. We are just
the basic question is education.
Yes.
And ocean literacy is not in any syllabus. And I've advocated ocean literacy to be taught in schools because only from the consciousness that you create from elementary school, you can start changing the mindset of people on throwing waste. And in conjunction with that, you can also connect something like collect waste for fuel. And this technology is already available. So waste come from land into river, river go to sea. So before it goes to sea, we need to stop it on land and before it goes into the river. Because once it goes to the sea, it's too late already. So we have to start at the basic where humans live, and that's where the biosphere is safeguarded. So ocean literacy can be part of a move, and certification can be given to teachers at elementary school, and we can also do online courses with certification and different levels of certification.
Great. That's a great note for this session. End of the great note. That's a great, Captain. We all, the audience, acknowledge that. It's a fitting note to end for this session because ocean literacy and awareness, creating the environment, starting from school to the higher education, we can educate the masses. That's a great word. And with that, we will conclude this session. And I'll just sum up by just 2 lines. That is, we had 4 brilliant presentations, one by Dr. Gary from Monash University. He outlined the need for international regulatory frameworks, network frameworks. He outlined broadly on the issues caused by plastic pollution, largely forming integral part of the marine litter. He also, yes, he said there is a necessity for internationally legal agreement for marine plastics, which is still lacking among the ASEAN countries and the IORA and other nations. So there is a need, but also highlighted various recycling issues, various aspects of management in Indian scenario. That was a great lecture by Dr. Gary. Yes, and next coming to Dr. Shalom. Madam highlighted the importance of plastic contamination, its management, how they contaminate benthic organisms, the fishes, how the coastal ecosystems in the Indian scenario, how it is getting affected by microplastic contamination, and also very, very valuable that this India-Australia summit as part of today's Monash University, it's very, very important because she's also a beneficiary for the Australian funding. So that also adds luster to this program because, and on this marine litter program, and also highlighted on the benchmarking of microplastics, especially the bioplastics, how you have a lot of varieties of polymers coming up. There is no specific benchmarking. This is also very crucial from her presentation. So the presentation largely highlighted on the field and management strategies. Akansha Tiwari, our young wildlife photographer and video filmmaker, and she was largely sharing her experiences from the field visit she had. Am I right? Yes. And from her, she developed, gave very important information on policy recommendations, major policy recommendations from her short experience. That's also very important and very, very interventional, I will say, because on public access to data, marine debris in the reefs, yes, wild reefs, in the marine oceans, the deep sea, how things are and how large mammals are getting affected, the disparity between stakeholder and lawmakers, that is also very important to be deliberated here. The marine debris, there are several lesser known concepts like standardization, documentation, and also reliable collection and storage. And finally, on EIA and river monitoring, funding for cleanup. These are all big questions to be answered, which I think has to be taken up in a larger forum and larger governmental and non-governmental setup, even including, should be considered the ASEAN forums and such international forums for funding. Now, the last presenter today, Dr. Sally Bakke, she highlighted the importance of climate change, which is really a triggering factor, which I told in my introductory note, for the marine litter and other social issues like this, the climate-induced changes, the extreme weather events, especially the large ocean marine ecosystem, the Bay of Bengal and the BIMTEC and the Asian, how it can contribute to the curbing the climate change, which is largely looming large in our ocean, especially in the Bay of Bengal region. And also she highlighted on the offshore wind potential in relation to the enshrined document under the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have all had a very productive interaction also. Thank you all and making this session a grand success. Thank you all and thank you all. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful session. Now I request Dr. Vijay Sakhuja to give away mementos as a token of appreciation to our panel. Dr. S. Bijoy Nandu. Jerry Matson. Dr. Shalom Yanatanga Vincent. Ms. Akansha Tiwari. I request the panel to come forward for photographs, sir. Thank you, everybody. We shall now wait for coffee or tea, according to your preference. Please get back so that we can start our next session in 10 minutes.